is now part of their national waters. Actually, it's an international channel that allows Russian vessels to come out of St. Petersburg and move into the Baltic. And they're talking about effectively blockading the Russians inside St. Petersburg. And so we're very close to being ready. By the way, I assume you're aware of what's happened with the French seizure of a Russian tanker. It's want to do, and they're the ones controlling your government, and that includes the Israel lobby, is to tie down as much Russian military power as they can while they proceed in the Middle East against Iran, Israel. Now, that doesn't make any difference in the short run because the American people can't pay the people on the Hill or in the White House enough money to derail the pro-Israel bent aircraft, refueling assets, ships. We've rebalanced the missile.
I think it's coming sooner rather than later. I think Glenn Greenwald is right. It's a matter of weeks, could even be days. But we're moving a lot of equipment into the region right now. Aircraft, refueling assets, ships. We've rebalanced the missile inventories in the region. So we're very close to being ready. By the way, I assume you're aware of what's happened with the French seizure of a Russian tanker, are you not? Well, I think this is very important because you can't view what happens in Ukraine and what's happening in the Middle East as entirely separate. I think there's a great deal of connectivity. The French decided to board a Russian tanker at sea. That's, of course, illegal. You can't just board a ship with your national armed forces. French military did it. And Macron has said, well, this is to disrupt the Russian business model. We disrupt it by holding on to this tanker full of oil for 2 weeks or so, then we'll let it go again. And ultimately, as a result, this will harm Russia. Well, frankly speaking, under international law, this is an act of war against Russia. At the same time, the Estonian government is saying that the waterway that comes out of St. Petersburg and empties into the Baltic is now part of their national waters. Actually, it's an international channel that allows Russian vessels to come out of St. Petersburg and move into the Baltic. And they're talking about effectively blockading the Russians inside St. Petersburg. Now, I don't know how they plan to proceed or what they want to use to do that, but the juxtaposition of the two together right now is very dangerous. I don't expect the Russians or President Putin to react instantly with the declaration of war. I'm sure they're putting together their response, but the fact that this is happening strengthens, believe it or not, the case for war in the Middle East. Because one of the things strategically that the neocons want to do, and they're the ones controlling your government, and that includes the Israel lobby, is to tie down as much Russian military power as they can while they proceed in the Middle East against Iran. So, the fact that this has happened now indicates to me that they're much closer to opening the campaign against Iran than we think. Yeah, there are similarities. The only thing I'd point out, though, and you know this better than I do, is I don't think the influencers for Israel are doing very well. I know that they're being paid something in the neighborhood of $7,000 a pop to put out pro-Israeli statements and observations, but I think public opinion in the United States has turned decisively against Israel. Now, that doesn't make any difference in the short run because the American people can't pay the people on the Hill or in the White House enough money to derail the pro-Israel spent. But nevertheless, the American people have turned away from it. And even though the members of the House and the Senate are handsomely rewarded financially for their support of Israel, even they have to take notice of what the American people think. So I think that's another reason why Mr. Netanyahu came to visit. It was to check signals, make sure everything was ready, make sure everybody understands what has to happen. He issued his directives not only to President Trump, but also, I'm told, to some cabinet members. So they're ready to go. And I think they want to get this done, if you want to use that terminology, as quickly as possible before they lose control of events in Washington, because the American people are fed up, I think. Well, I think that's true. I mean, the peace talks was always a smoke OKC screen. It was never serious. There's no chance for that 2 1-point plan to be accepted by anybody. Neither the Israelis nor the Palestinians. For the Palestinians, it's a sort of willing subjugation to Israeli Jewish dominance in perpetuity. They're not going to sign up for that. And Mr. Netanyahu wants blood. He wants the complete annihilation of the Palestinians, as do his supporters. So there will be no peace settlement. This is you get one of two outcomes ultimately. You either get Israel or you get Palestine. If there's a Palestine, there is no longer an Israel. If you get Israel out of this terrible war that we're about to embark on, there is no Palestine. It's that simple. But I think what is happening right now with Russia is very important because in people's minds in Washington, this is diverting Russian attention away from the Middle East. Now, you also brought something else up. You said, what are the similarities? There are some differences this time, I'm told. And that is, we're going to see a lot more gravity bombs. That is, bombs that may have the precision kits on them, but you're talking about bombs that have to be delivered by fighter bombers, various kinds of aircraft at much closer to Iranian air defenses than in the past. We also are going to rely, I'm told, very heavily on old Tomahawk missiles. In other words, missiles that have been in the inventory for some time. And then we will dip into the precious reserves that we have involving SM-6 standard missiles, the THAAD missile and other more rare commodities, but extraordinarily valuable and important. So it's not exactly the same because we cannot bring everything to this that we did the last time. That depends heavily, I would say, on Iran's response. Last time, believe it or not, the Iranians exercised a lot of restraint. If they exercise restraint this time around, I'd be surprised. I rather suspect that they will employ whatever they've got. My great concern is as the damage is sustained in Israel, the demand for the use of a nuclear weapon against Iran will be enormous. The other possibility is that this time Egypt, the Turks may not sit this out. There is the outside possibility the Egyptians in particular may decide that they can no longer take the hit. They've got to fight. The Turks have been pushed to the edge. Erdogan wants to play both sides to the middle. He's done that very well. But if you listen carefully to the statements he's made recently, it sounds as though the Turks are ready to finally play the cards and show us what they hold. We'll see. You know, remember you've got this Saudi-Paki alliance that was created, and all of these states right now have the backing of China. And when I say backing, I'm talking about not just military assistance, but also financial. That's very important to the Turks, very important to the Egyptians, and of course the Saudis and the Pakis are very interested in that financial backing as well. But the Pakistanis bring nuclear weapons technology to the fight. And the Pakistanis have made it very clear that their bomb is an Islamic bomb. In other words, if their brothers in the Middle East need the weapon, they will have it. Well, but I was still on active duty. I had to take a trip down to the Naval Warfare Center, and people down there were complaining about the access that Israelis had. They were allowed to see everything, go anywhere, do whatever they wanted. And later on, after I got out of the service and I walked through the Joint Staff area, I was surprised to see large numbers of deaths with little Israeli flags on them. And this was either an American citizen with Israeli citizenship as well, or perhaps just Israeli enthusiasts in the group. I don't know. I was surprised to see that. I had not seen that in the past. It's very rare that you see a foreign flag in the Pentagon unless it's a liaison office where you have someone stationed from Britain or Australia or somewhere else. So I'm afraid he's probably right. And I think it's going to get a lot worse before it gets better because, to be perfectly blunt with you, the Israelis and Mr. Netanyahu are in charge. That's your government. We can't do this anymore. We need to get out of that business. And we have to build relations with all of these countries on the basis of some commonality of interest. There may not be any cultural commonality. That's fine. It doesn't have to be. But there is usually a strategic commonality of interest based on shared economic development and so forth. We've got to get out of this sort of straitjacket of hostility and conflict with the rest of the world. We all thought that Trump might do that. We've gotten an education. We now know he won't. And as a result, things are going to get worse for us, not better. I think that the arguments in that post are all legitimate. The problem is that the use of American military power is not the solution to our problem. You know, he talks in there about the numbers of oil rigs that are still in operation at 1/3 of the count a decade ago. We've got to go back further than that. When's the last time we built an oil refinery? How many active refineries do we have today compared with what we had in the past? We have neglected all of the things that are important at home. And again, we voted for Trump because he promised to end domestic neglect. In other words, he would turn to the infrastructure. He would turn to the criminality. He would do something about the border and immigration and so forth. He's done some of it, but it's a fraction of what he needs to do. And unfortunately, this desire, this appetite, insatiable appetite for overseas adventurism is crushing anything positive that he might do at home. And then when you look at what he's assembled in the Caribbean, I don't think he expects 4,000 Marines to do a great deal in Venezuela. Of course, I'm sure we have CIA mercenaries and agents and so forth in nearby Colombia, maybe in Ghana, all of whom can operate in conjunction with the Marines. And most of the 26 or 27 million people in Venezuela are on the coast. But you're not going to exert any positive control for very long. You're going to end up dealing with a very hostile population, not because they all love Maduro. That's not the point. But even the weakest people in the world will usually prefer the people they have in their armed forces, in their police, and in their government to us and whatever we want to impose. So the answer to Venezuela right now is not to double down on what is ostensibly a failed policy in the region, which is to threaten everybody. We've got to get out of that business and look instead of, well, what are the interests of the state? And if we don't like the president, that's fine. President Trump doesn't have to meet with him. He needs somebody else. But you've got to sit down with these people, understand their interests, and find a way to create that commonality that we were talking about before. And remember, we could go in there very, very quickly with a couple of thousand technicians and engineers and do brilliant work inside Venezuela to report all of the oil and gas infrastructure, but we're not doing it because we've decided we don't like the government. And he says, no, President Trump said, no, this is not about regime change. Well, if it's not about regime change, what's your problem with Venezuela? We're the ones that put up the CIA puppet, a few years ago and tried to shove them down the throats of everybody in Venezuela. So if it's not regime change, then do business with the regime. Whether it conforms entirely to your preferences is irrelevant. What's the business angle? And I would think that we could go in there and do a much better job than the Chinese. We're much closer to the United States. We have many, many more people that already speak Spanish. So I wouldn't bomb, attack, strafe, whatever it is, Venezuela at this point. I don't see how that improves things. And again, I think we discussed this before. Most of the drugs that have come out of Venezuela, not Not very much, quite frankly, in comparison to other states. Yeah, but by the way, people said, well, the Venezuelans will fight like tigers. No, they won't. That's not it. But once you're in the country, they're not going to be very happy to have you there, and they're going to make life miserable for you. The Iraqis in 2003 did not fight like tigers. We knew that would not happen, okay? There was remarkably little resistance. We got all the way to Baghdad with 1 dead in the 3rd Infantry Division. So who are we kidding? That wasn't the issue. The issue is, what are you trying to achieve there? And is that goal going to be achieved because you put a lot of people, Americans, in uniform with guns on the ground? I think the answer in Iraq was absolutely not. And it's not the right solution for Venezuela. And frankly, we have other things closer to home. President Trump has gone into Washington and people are saying, oh, well, that's terrible. No, it isn't. Washington is a tragic place. That city has suffered with unending criminal action for too long. The place has been an embarrassment to us around the world. No capital of a great power like the United States should be allowed to sink to the levels that Washington has. President Trump is right about that. President Trump has talked about, if you've got 3 or 4 people being killed every weekend, that's a war, and that's a war we need to stop. He's correct about that. All of those things that he wants to do that make sense are being put at risk by these overseas interventions. Adding yet another failure to what is already a failed enterprise in Ukraine, I would argue a failed enterprise in the Middle East is not going to help him. It's not going to help the American people. It'll probably put everything that he wants to do at risk. He's starting to look a lot like LBJ. He has some things he wants to do domestically that are vital for the survival of our country, our social cohesion, the enforcement of federal law. But all of that could be lost by this overseas interventionism, this epidemic in Washington of great power. ITIS, everyone wants to feel powerful, and you feel powerful when you're bombing somebody. All of that nonsense needs to go away. But he's doing both. And that's what LBJ did in Vietnam, and he should have realized early on this is a disaster. He had plenty of people telling him that. And then Nixon, when he came into power, very few people are aware of this, but when he met with the Army generals, we're talking about the 4 stars who were in charge and some of the 3 stars, they all said, Mr. President, get out. We're not going to achieve anything in Vietnam, just withdraw. And of course, he had people surrounding him in the White House, including Kissinger, who said, oh no, you can't just leave. The Soviets will think we're weak. The Chinese will think we're weak. Well, we now know in retrospect, they both couldn't figure out what we were doing there to begin with, right? For the same reason that, we should never have gone into Afghanistan. We thought the Soviets were crazy for going into that place. We got to get out of this. But President Trump, instead of doing that, has turned in the opposite direction. And we could speculate for hours on why, but he has. And someone tried to tell me the other day, well, this is because there's a secret government, that we know nothing about. This is what Americans are becoming very conspiratorial now. There's a secret government. The same people who controlled Biden now control him. I'm not so sure. But I think President Trump has really shot himself in the proverbial foot. And the best thing he can do is send somebody to speak to Maduro, come up with some sort of solution, and then get all these troops out of there and defuse the situation. Should do the same thing in Ukraine. I've done as much as I can do. We're out. And the Europeans, they're going to have new governments. Macron is in a lot of trouble. Starmer, my goodness. I'm surprised Starmer is still breathing, based upon the damage he's done to the British people. That's all going to end. These people are going to be gone. They're going to be replaced, and suddenly Putin is going to have an audience in front of him. whether it's in Moscow or somewhere else, and they're going to put an end to this, and we're going to look ridiculous. Well, I think in Dallas we'll have this panel which has the Judge Dialatano as well as Natalie Brunell. Natalie Brunell is a great financial analyst, has a very clear grasp of what's happening in the financial world, and then of course I'll be there. I'll stumble through and do the best I can. But the bottom line is that this is supposed to be a conversation. We don't expect everybody to come in there and agree with everything that they hear from the panel. That's not the point. We'll answer the questions that are raised, and then we'll turn to the audience. So the audience will have a chance to challenge our answers or to provide different answers or both. And we want to do this over time across the country because we're trying to build the foundation for a third way, a third party, ultimately, because we know we're dealing with a uniarty. Yeah, we've got good men like Thomas Massey, Marjorie Taylor Greene, Ro Connor, others that are interested in finding solutions that make sense, but frankly, the majority aren't. Too many of them are on the payroll of some lobby, not just the Israel lobby. There are many different lobbies. All you have to do is look at the pharmaceuticals and the enormous resistance they're presenting to RFK Jr. So the bottom line is we want to find out what people think. So that's why you need to show up, because you'll have an opportunity to express yourself. Now, we haven't got a cutoff date for ticket sales, but that could happen, especially as we close in on the numbers that we're looking for, and they are starting to pick up. I get the impression people buy tickets late at the last minute. If that's true, just keep that in mind. This may come before the end of September that we have to cut it off. So I would urge people, if you plan to buy, do it now. Don't wait. Well, I hope we'll see you out there. You know, I'd be very disappointed if I look into the audience and I don't see your smiling face. Well, the other person that's going to be with us on this panel is Dr. Ravzi, and she's the one who will frame the questions and ask them. But she's a very well-educated, thoughtful person in her own right. She taught at the university level. She still teaches, and she has an interesting background. So you've got a group of people on the stage, I think, that will be good from the standpoint of some diversity of opinion. I know that word diversity, we like to apply it to everything, but thinking we have, but you really are going to see a diversity of opinion and thinking there. We don't all agree on everything. We may agree on 65, 70% of the issues, but you're going to see disagreements, and I happen to think that's a healthy thing. Well, I'm sure that somebody is covering every inch of the airplane to look for listening devices, because obviously Qatar will transmit whatever it discovers on the plane back to China. Right. Who knows? Yeah. Chris just put up a full screen. You and I will be together with some other wonderful folks in Dallas on October 4th at the Frontiers of Flight Museum, starting a national conversation where the two-party system has failed us domestically and foreign policy-wise. Yeah, I think there's a lot to talk about, and Natalie Brunell is going to have her hands full talking about the financial aspects because of Besant's attempt to change from long-term debt to short-term debt by going to T-bills instead of treasuries, because obviously people don't want to buy any long-term debt anymore, right? So we're trying to sell the debt for 52 weeks or 30 weeks and 40 weeks and rapidly turn it over, as though that is going to disguise our true position. And of course, now we have a lot of interest in crypto and essentially using crypto as another means of dealing with our debt. I think this is a very interesting time. I hope people pay attention and come to this. I'm sure they'll have lots of questions and they'll have an opportunity to express their opinions, because after we speak, we're going to hand people the mic after each of these questions and let them express their views. I hope they come. because this is an experiment. This is, we hope, the beginning of something bigger. It's a search judge, right? New way forward. The uni party doesn't work. I'm thrilled to be part of it and looking forward to it. Chris, if you want to put that up one more time, if you can take a screenshot and then scan, you see that little QR code there. You can find out more about this and get tickets if you're going to be in the area. Colonel, thank you very much. I know we're all over the place. I appreciate very much your time. Thank you. Best to you, and look forward to seeing you next week.